When we talk about boundaries, many people immediately think of walls, ultimatums, or emotional distance, but boundaries are none of those things at their core. Boundaries are simply the lines that define where you end and someone else begins, emotionally, mentally, and relationally. They are not tools for punishment or control, but signals of self-respect and self-awareness. When you don't set boundaries, you aren't being kind or flexible, you are often abandoning your own needs. People are not mind readers, and silence is not clarity. When you allow behavior that hurts you without naming it, you unintentionally normalize it. Over time, what was once just this once becomes the baseline expectation. This is how resentment quietly grows while everyone else believes everything is fine. Boundaries exist to prevent that quiet erosion of self-worth. They are less about changing others and more about honoring yourself consistently. And many of us were taught that setting boundaries is rude, selfish, or dramatic, especially if it makes other people uncomfortable. We learn to prioritize being liked over being respected and peace over honesty. Brené Brown often reminds us that discomfort is not the same as danger, even though our nervous systems sometimes react as if it is. Saying no, asking for respect, or naming what doesn't work can feel threatening when you've been rewarded for compliance. But avoiding discomfort does not create safety, it creates silence. Silence over time teaches people that your feelings are negotiable. When you swallow your needs to keep the peace is never real because it costs you too much. Boundaries are the language of self-trust. They tell the world and yourself that your limits matter. Without them, relationships become uneven and emotionally unsafe, and people will often say they should know better, but knowing better and doing better are not the same thing. Most people behave based on what is tolerated, not what is hoped for. If disrespect is met with silence, slaughter, or emotional withdrawal instead of clarity, it doesn't register as a problem. Boundaries give behavior a mirror. They say, this is where I stand and this is what I'm available for. That clarity can feel jarring to people who benefited from your lack of limits. It can even trigger guilt, because you may worry about being seen as difficult or ungrateful. But guilt is not always a signal that you are wrong. Often it is a sign that you are breaking an old pattern. Boundaries don't require anger or long explanations. They require consistency and self-respect in action. And one of the hardest truths about boundaries is that they reveal rather than create the quality of a relationship. When you set a boundary, people show you who they are by how they respond. Some will adjust, listen, and respect the line because they value you. Others will minimize, push back, or mock your needs because the old dynamic worked in their favor. That reaction is information. Boundaries don't ruin good relationships. They expose unhealthy ones. If someone only feels comfortable with you when you are overachieving, exhausted, or silent, the relationship was never balanced. Respect grows where self-respect is visible. When you honor your limits, you model how you expect to be treated. That modeling becomes the standard, not the exception. And self-respect is not loud, aggressive, or dramatic, but it is firm and steady. Boundaries don't need to be announced repeatedly or justified endlessly. They are reinforced through follow-through, not persuasion. If you say something doesn't work for you but continue to accept it, the message gets lost. Consistency is what teaches people that your words have weight. This is why boundaries feel scary at first, because they require you to back yourself even when others don't immediately approve. Over time, that self-alignment builds confidence and emotional safety. You begin to trust yourself because you no longer betray your own needs. The standard you set becomes less about controlling outcomes and more about staying true to yourself. In that space, respect stops being requested and starts being expected. Clarity is often misunderstood as confrontation, but in reality, it is one of the most compassionate things you can offer in a relationship. When expectations remain unspoken, people fill in the gaps with assumptions, and assumptions almost always lead to disappointment. Brené Brown teaches that avoiding hard conversations doesn't protect connection, it slowly corrodes it. When you stay silent about what you need, you may believe you're being kind, but what you're really doing is creating confusion. Confusion breeds resentment, and resentment eventually leaks out through tone withdrawal or passive aggression. At that point, the damage feels sudden, but it was quietly building all along. Clarity prevents that slow burn by naming reality early. It allows everyone to stand on solid ground instead of emotional guesswork. Being clear doesn't mean being harsh, it means being honest before anger takes over. It's an invitation to mutual understanding rather than a surprise confrontation later. And many people fear clarity because they associate it with rejection, conflict, or being perceived as difficult. This fear often comes from past experiences where honesty was punished or dismissed. Over time, we learn to soften our needs, hint instead of state, and hope others will just get it. But hinting is not communicating and hoping is not a strategy. Brené Brown emphasizes that unexpressed expectations are a setup for disappointment on both sides. When you expect someone to read between the lines, you're giving them an impossible task. Clear communication actually reduces conflict because it removes ambiguity. It gives people the chance to show up well instead of guessing wrong. Avoiding clarity may feel safer in the moment, but it creates emotional distance over time. Relationships thrive on shared understanding, not silent endurance. Courage shows up not as perfection, but as the willingness to speak honestly even when your voice shakes. And resentment is often a sign that clarity was missing earlier. It's what happens when you repeatedly override your own needs in the name of keeping the peace. On the surface, everything looks calm, but internally frustration is stacking up. Brené Brown describes resentment as the most corrosive emotion in relationships because it poisons connection from the inside. When you finally speak up after months or years, the intensity surprises everyone, including you. The other person may feel blindsided, insisting they didn't know there was a problem. From their perspective, that may be true. Clarity given early sounds like guidance. Clarity given late sounds like criticism. This is why timing matters as much as truth. Speaking clearly when something first feels off is an act of self-respect and relational care. It prevents emotional debt from accumulating. Honest communication keeps small issues from becoming breaking points. And being clear also requires vulnerability, because you risk not being met the way you hope. You risk someone misunderstanding you, disagreeing, or choosing not to change. Brené Brown reminds us that vulnerability is not about controlling the outcome, but about showing up authentically. When you communicate clearly, you're not demanding compliance, you're sharing your reality. What the other person does with that information is their responsibility. This can feel unsettling if you're used to managing other people's emotions. But clarity frees you from that burden. It allows you to stop performing emotional gymnastics to keep everyone comfortable. Even if the response isn't ideal, you gain valuable information about the relationship. You learn whether there is room for mutual respect and growth. Clear communication creates emotional integrity, where your inner experience matches your outer expression. That alignment builds trust within yourself first, and over time, practicing clarity reshapes how you see yourself and how others engage with you. You begin to recognize that your needs are not inconveniences, but valid parts of being human. You stop waiting until you're overwhelmed to speak, and instead address things while they're still manageable. Brené Brown often says that clear boundaries and communication are acts of kindness, because they prevent confusion and emotional harm. When you are clear, you reduce the likelihood of misunderstanding and defensiveness. You give relationships a chance to evolve instead of silently deteriorate. Even when clarity leads to difficult conversations, it preserves your integrity. You no longer carry the weight of unsaid words. The standard shifts from emotional guessing games to honest dialogue. In that space, connection becomes grounded, respectful, and real. Discomfort is often mistaken for a warning sign, but in reality, it is frequently a signal of growth. When you begin to choose yourself, especially if you've spent years prioritizing others, discomfort shows up fast and loud. It feels wrong to say no when you're used to saying yes. It feels selfish to ask for respect when you've been praised for being easygoing. Brené Brown teaches that this discomfort is not evidence of failure, but proof that you're stepping out of self-betrayal. Every time you ignore your own limits to keep someone else comfortable, you teach yourself that your needs come last. That lesson sinks deep over time and erodes your sense of worth. Choosing discomfort interrupts that pattern. It forces you to sit with the fear of disapproval rather than the pain of resentment. One discomfort is temporary, the other becomes chronic. Self-worth demands the courage to feel uncomfortable on purpose. And many people stay in situations that drain them not because they don't see the problem, but because they fear the emotional cost of addressing it. They imagine conflict, rejection, or being misunderstood, and that fear feels unbearable. Brené Brown reminds us that avoiding discomfort doesn't eliminate pain, it just delays it. The pain shows up later as exhaustion, bitterness, or emotional numbness. When you constantly stretch yourself beyond your limits, your body and mind keep score. You may smile on the outside while feeling invisible on the inside. This internal split is exhausting and unsustainable. Discomfort, on the other hand, is honest. It's the feeling of standing in your truth without knowing how others will react. That uncertainty is scary, but it's also clean. There is no hidden emotional debt accumulating in the background. You are present, awake, and aligned with yourself. And self-worth is built in moments where you choose integrity over approval. These moments are rarely dramatic, but they are deeply uncomfortable. It might look like speaking up when your voice shakes or declining something that makes you feel guilty. Brené Brown emphasizes that courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. When you choose yourself, you may temporarily disappoint others who are accustomed to your overgiving. That disappointment can feel heavy, especially if you've tied your value to being needed or liked. But there is a deeper disappointment that comes from abandoning yourself repeatedly. That kind of disappointment turns inward and becomes shame. Discomfort is the doorway out of that cycle. Each time you tolerate the unease of honoring your limits, your self-trust grows stronger. You start to believe that you can handle hard feelings without collapsing. And there is a common belief that strong people don't feel discomfort, but Brené Brown challenges that idea completely. Strong people feel discomfort and choose to move through it rather than around it. They understand that boundaries, honesty, and self-respect often disrupt the status quo. When you raise your standard, relationships must either rise to meet it or reveal their limitations. That transition period is uncomfortable because it comes with uncertainty and loss of familiarity. You may grieve the version of yourself who kept everyone happy at your own expense. You may also grieve relationships that can't survive your growth. This grief doesn't mean you made the wrong choice, it means you made a brave one. Discomfort becomes a teacher instead of a threat. It teaches you where you've been small and where you're ready to expand. Growth rarely feels gentle at first. And over time, choosing discomfort over self-abandonment changes how you experience your life. You stop living on emotional autopilot and start responding with intention. Brené Brown often speaks about living wholeheartedly, which requires the courage to be seen as you are, not as you perform. That kind of living demands regular discomfort because it asks you to stay present instead of numbing out. When you honor your self-worth, you feel more grounded even in difficult situations. You may still feel fear, but it no longer controls your decisions. Discomfort becomes familiar, almost welcome, because you recognize it as the cost of authenticity. You learn that peace doesn't come from avoiding hard moments, but from knowing you didn't abandon yourself in them. The more you practice this, the less you fear other people's reactions. Your worth stops being negotiated and starts being embodied. The way people treat you is rarely shaped by what you say once, but by what you consistently accept over time. But behavior sets expectations. Brené Brown teaches that humans learn relational rules through patterns, not promises. If someone repeatedly crosses a line and nothing changes, the message they receive is that the line was flexible or imaginary. Tolerance becomes permission when it is repeated without consequence. This is not about blame, but about awareness. Many people unknowingly teach others how to treat them by staying silent, laughing things off, or over-explaining their pain. These responses soften the impact of disrespect instead of naming it. Over time, this creates a dynamic where your discomfort becomes invisible. What you tolerate slowly shapes the emotional culture of your relationships. Standards are taught through action, not intention. And consistency is what gives standards their power. One boundary stated once but ignored repeatedly becomes background noise. Brené Brown often emphasizes that integrity is choosing courage over comfort again and again. When your actions align with your values, people learn that you mean what you say. This doesn't require dramatic confrontations or ultimatums. It requires follow-through even when it feels uncomfortable or inconvenient. If you say something doesn't work for you but continue to allow it, confusion replaces clarity. People respond to what is reinforced, not what is explained. Repetition teaches, not speeches. Each time you choose self-respect in action, you reinforce the standard you're setting. Over time, those standards become predictable, and predictability creates respect. Others know where you stand because you stand there consistently. And many people believe that if they just explain themselves well enough, others will finally change. But over-explaining often weakens the standard instead of strengthening it. Brené Brown reminds us that boundaries are not about convincing others, but about being clear with ourselves. When you negotiate your limits every time they're challenged, you send the message that your needs are debatable. This invites pushback, not respect. People may argue, minimize, or test you to see how firm the boundary really is. What stops that testing is consistency, not emotional appeals. When your behavior changes, the dynamic changes. You don't need to justify your worth for it to be real. Standards become real when they are lived, not defended. Silence paired with consistent action is often more powerful than long explanations. The message lands because it is embodied. And it's important to understand that setting standards doesn't guarantee approval. Some people will resist because your growth disrupts their comfort. Brené Brown teaches that not everyone will celebrate your boundaries, especially those who benefited from your lack of them. This resistance can look like guilt-tripping sarcasm or accusations of being different or cold. These reactions are attempts to pull you back into the old pattern. If you give in to avoid discomfort, the standard collapses. But if you stay grounded, even quietly, the dynamic begins to shift. Some people will adapt because they value the relationship. Others may distance themselves because the relationship was built on imbalance. This is painful, but it is also revealing. Standards don't drive people away. They filter out dynamics that require your self-erasure. And over time, living your standards changes how you see yourself. You begin to trust your own word because you honor with action. Brené Brown often speaks about self-trust as the foundation of courage and connection. When you stop tolerating what hurts you, you stop normalizing your own pain. Your nervous system starts to relax because it no longer has to brace for repeated disrespect. You become more present, less guarded, and less resentful. People around you sense this shift even if they can't name it. Your energy changes because you are no longer negotiating your worth internally. Standards become quiet, steady, and deeply rooted. They don't need to be announced because they are visible. Respect begins to feel less like something you chase and more like something that naturally surrounds you.